guys.
Oh wow, that was fast. Alright, get that door shut all the way. It's just so loud. Sorry. I know their audio is much more entertaining.
All right. Well, I guess get started tonight. Let's talk about, we had a whole bunch of different homework, and I think that's probably what we'll just be going over today, is working through some of these different bits of homework, and then maybe a little bit more. I'm trying to get people on the same page. Let me let off the bat, if we take a look at this tweet social media homework, that'll be fun because I haven't looked at that code at all. So how did people feel about the quiz? Any questions on the quiz? I mean, that last one, but I feel like that was sort of a little open-ended. What was interesting, different types of answers. Yeah, I didn't write it. I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, I challenged the grading on the last question.
Uh-oh.
Well, did you have? Yes, I'm not alone. It's you. It's like you're like standard. Yeah, like the next questions.
Any issues with any of the other questions? So let's see.
I did thought a little bit. Make sure I was like, really, you feel like it's a trick.
I mean, all the rest of these were pretty straightforward, I think, questions.
How you ask was with that one, or one, if it's capitalized or not.
Noticing the slash and
Yeah.
it says
Yeah,
versus state.
Yep. There's some very subtle bits here.
Yeah, I felt like they were trying that trick.
Yeah, that's a good one. But people were okay with some of the other ones. Like, it seemed like people did pretty well in general.
Yeah, I think the only thing I probably was in the last one, and I think there was one.
So, you know.
Well, what is the component managed internally? And I said like props, but it was like state.
It's state, yeah. And that's a key thing to recognize the difference between the two, right? Is you pass props in and the component doesn't really manage that.
I guess I wasn't thinking of what manage.
Right.
Manage for it, like I wasn't thinking of manage means it changes. I thought it meant just you send it into it and then it like puts it somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
That's managing.
I get what you're saying. But yeah. All right. So I mean, looks like people did pretty good for the most part. Average of, 37.5, and considering that last question was a challenge, we can give a little bit of a bump this up by 5.
I want to know what the answer was.
Yeah, I think that there were different answers, like balance.
I think there's different possible valid answers. I have no clue what it was looking for. But let's see. What do we have here? It just says write out a function or class component that returns your name. So this shouldn't be too hard. Let's just let's make a new file just right here and just create something with it just to see how we want it to look. Close this over here. Oh, don't go back. Oh man. Wow. It's like freaking out. Let me call this JavaScript React. That's what I call it. Let's do it as a function component. I mean, we could write it out in a different way. What do we want to call it? Name. All right. And how does a function component work? We just a function, right? So we pass in props of some kind.
And then I just did that it returned it was an H1 or something, and inside of it just had props dot name.
Right. So I'm gonna just a second. Let me pop back over here and take a look. that returns your name. I mean, that does work. That's returning a little more. I don't know what was exactly being looked for, but we could do that, right? So like an H1 would return your name.
Or should it just been?
Sorry. So this would need to assume that we're getting some sort of name in, right?
Yeah.
So I presume we're putting something inside of this H1. What do we want to put there?
I did it with curly. not
Curly braces.
I just assumed that
Sure.
that would be the name of it.
I mean, that would be fine, right? At its most basic variant of something like this, you could write this out because you can return a string as a valid return value from a component. So you could do something like, if you assume name is your property, like,
I'm wondering if would that have been right if we just did that?
I don't know.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I need to know.
I don't know. Let me see if I can look at I don't write these things. I don't know how to check and see what this is looking for. Oh, let's see. Answer key. What? That's not what I wanted. Edit question. I have no idea.
I know there's like a way. Is it the I? No, what is it? The thing is it at the top? One of those.
Were you guys getting results immediately?
I just asked for that.
You submit the.
You can pull up the answer. I didn't remember. There's like two versions. There's a one where it just has the questions and like this, and then there's one that has the answer. There's another one that has. What's the artist palette?
What's that?
Artist palette.
Customize theme, preview, settings. This isn't right. All right, that tells me it's a multiple choice one. This one tells me it was 5 points. I don't know if we had an answer in here. I think this was just intended to make sure that nobody got 100.
Oh.
I don't know. Yeah. All right. So let's keep moving on. The next thing that we had. Oops, wrong direction. Let me come over this way, close this. I don't care about you. Don't say it, go away. Was to work on our app. And we wanted to do a couple bits of refinement to our stopwatch app. Do you remember what those were?
Make it display in hour, minutes, seconds, and get the clear button working.
Get the clear button working, yep. All right, so let's, what do you want to start with?
We already did that, right? Or
Well, you guys did, yeah. I just want to make sure, who finished this? Who got it displaying that way and got the clear button working? All right.
It's not working anymore now.
Oh, his was, yeah, that was beautiful, right? He added in a lot of styling, which that's sort of the next thing I was wanting to get to today, but I definitely did not get there. So we can go look at the his version of it. Open the app. It may not be running. Oh, it is. There we go. It's got a lot of pretty styling going on and other stuff. But did anybody run into problems? Anybody try this and run into problems where they weren't able to get it done? No. Not sure. What? You didn't finish? Did you get part of it done? No? All right. Was that, did you get stuck on something or was it just time thing? Time? All right. So I mean, just to continue on with it, let's go ahead and try and work through that, I guess, as a group. And out of these 2 bits, making this prettier, that's, like I said, that shouldn't be too bad. Or, because it's pretty much just stuff that we've done before, or implementing the clear button. Which one do you want to start with? Clear button? All right. Let's get our clear button working. Maybe I can make that a hair smaller. Is that still large enough for everybody to see? People in the back, can you see that just fine? Yeah? All right, cool. That'll let me fit a little more on. Let's go ahead and start from there, right? This app, we're not really going to be doing much in there. I'm just going to throw it over here. Maybe I'll close the file even. Not doing anything with it right now. So let's start with this stopwatch file, working our way up. Or actually, I'm just going to jump right to the clear button, move it over to work on. So the clear button, what it does right now is it takes an on-click, or it takes in an on-clear property and does something with whatever was passed in. So let's look at what we're calling here. We've got it at this point in our code. We've got an instance of it in our stopwatch, but our on-clear isn't actually hooked up to anything. So it's not telling it to do anything.
Wait, something happened.
Well, that's holding us in suspense.
All my stuff is gone.
What I think there was set in state, like time lapse that they had, state just 0, 5 and 0.
Oh, it's because I'm on a branch, right, or something?
It might be. If you just checked out the lesson, like lesson 3, then yeah, you would need to, it's best to go back to whatever you've committed if you've been committing your code separately.
I actually haven't done that.
So one of the first questions I got asked, which I think was a good question, is about the clear button functionality. How do we want it to work? Do we want it always enabled, only enabled when our stopwatch isn't running? You know, what do we want to happen when you click it? So I'm going to go with the sort of naive approach first. The naive approach being essentially just, well, it's going to cause a problem, I think. Elapsed time. No, that'll be fine. So the naive approach being we're just resetting the elapsed time to 0 when you click the clear button, right? So it doesn't really care what the other state is or what's going on with the start or stop button.
I thought it was running as well, like swimming pools.
What's that?
It's running like the state.
No, you flip okay, yeah.
Just to be sure.
Yeah, so we'll be able to do both of that, right? But we can start with just this very naive version, which is just going to, what we want to do is set our elapsed time back to 0 when you click the clear button. So what we need to do there is we're going to need to, let me close this real fast. We're going to need to have a function that we pass in for this on clear into our clear button, right? And we could define it inline here, but let's follow the same pattern we've done here. So it's like on clear. So does anybody want to help do what's the code to just reset our elapsed time?
I just did the set state elapsed time.
That set state elapsed time is 0. And then I heard somebody say that they also, and we could do that pretty easily. somebody cleared the interval as well, right? So let's look at what the difference is, right? If we do this, so we've created our onClear. Is there anything else I need to do to create a method that has this inside of it? The bind, right? Our magic line. So let's put our magic line up here.
What's the difference to do that onClear function up there or be like an error function?
Because
we're using the console log, like.
Yeah, we were doing an arrow function right here,
Yeah,
right
so
now.
Yeah, so this says data, just write it down there.
So I'll convert it in just a second and show you. There's no difference. I'm going with the more, I mean, there is a little bit of a difference. I'll explain what it is in a minute. But there's not a difference that really matters 95% of the time. It is a lot of times, especially if you're doing something very simple, easier to do the arrow function version. I'm going with the long form, so I'm just trying to stick with a common pattern for the way I'm creating stuff, and also to show the more long form variant. But I'll talk about the very slight difference in a minute as well, and why you may not do that one. So first, I'll write it out this way, right? This dot on clear, just like it's dot bind to this. All right, and now, so we've added an on clear. Let me double check here. I am not running my server, so, well, maybe I am. Hold on. Go check my, oh, looks like it might be running. But I don't, what else do I need to do to get that working?
You need to pass that.
I need to pass that here, right? So instead of this being this, it'll be this dot on clear, because I'm just passing a reference directly to that function. I don't need to invoke it. This is something that trips up people a lot is, when you put those parentheses there, you're invoking the function. So you're calling it. If you just want to pass a reference to it so something else can invoke it, you just pass it without those. And then let's go see if this is working. Why did that go there? Why am I here? Thought I changed my order of this stuff. All right, you go on that side. There we go. So let's give this a shot. Let me just refresh just in case. I'm gonna try to start it. Let me try to clear. Looks like it's working. So if I pause and clear, we go back to 0. Really nice and simple, right? Not very hard. You can even do it while it's running right now because we didn't have any special logic and we didn't do anything else to change the fact that it was running. Now, what I heard mentioned, and I think, I don't think there's a right or wrong. This is just one of those things where you might do like user testing or something to figure out what would be the preferred behavior. Is you could also decide to clear the interval when you could set your state to not running and clear your interval. When you clear, so you could be like, is running becomes false. So you're not running anymore. And clear interval, this dot, what did we call it? Interval ID. So that's another bit of logic you could have, and that will change the functionality of it. So now it's going to clear it and stop it. And you'll notice this is where we get into some of the beautiful aspects of working with React components and some of that stuff is we didn't have to. So if you watch this, we go from the pause to the start button without any extra logic that we had to do that said, ooh, when I hit clear, remember to reset the pause button and convert it back over to the start button, right? That's very common when you're working with front-end stuff is all of the other state changes that you have to make. You have to go through all the bits of code and say like, oh, when I do this, also change this and that. But since all of these React components are just rendering off of their state at any point in time, all we had to do was change our isRunning state to false. And we didn't care about what the UI looked like before. We just say, just render off this new state. We're not running anymore, and it did that, right? A lot of anyone who's worked with other front-end stuff a lot of times you're writing this complex sort of if-based logic where you'd say, ooh, if I was running, then take my button from pause to start. You know, if I was not running, then don't do that, etc. But we got to go with a much simpler mental model here because of the way React works. It's just change your state, re-render the whole thing from scratch. Any questions about this on clear? No? So I think, again, either one of these two approaches is perfectly fine in terms of how it works. And there's also a third that would be a valid approach as well and is a little more interesting. And that's what's happening over here, which is that the clear button is only available when, I mean, there's a couple options here, right? You could always have it available, but you notice how many variables there are, even in an app this simple, how many different ways you can write this out. But the idea here is the clear button doesn't work when you're at 0 or when you're running. But if you're at non-zero, then you can clear, right? Clear button. You need to have some conditional logic inside of your components to say when it's enabled versus not enabled, which is perfectly fine to do. It's actually not that hard for us to do. And that could be done in a lot of different ways. So I'm going to tackle that just to sort of show what's going to happen there, but I'll probably won't leave it. We'll see. So one way we could do that with our clear button would be we could pass an additional prop into our clear button. See, we could try and do something complex here, but we could pass an additional prop in there. So what property or properties could we pass in that would let the button itself know whether or not it should be enabled or disabled? In that instance, when is it disabled? It's disabled when it's running, right? And it's enabled when it's not running. So what would it is running, right? So we could pass that in. We could also instead, I mean, there's multiple ways you could do this because you might think this gets into some debates about how to build out an application, right? Some people may say, well, my clear button shouldn't know if I'm running or not. It should just know if it's disabled. Because knowing whether or not it's running is sort of more information than it needs. So it doesn't have to have the same name. So an option could be is disabled. And right now we could say, oh, that's just going to be equal to this dot state dot is running, the opposite of that, right? So now we added a variable to our clear button to say when it is or isn't disabled. And now we could use that over here. There's actually a property on buttons, which is disabled. I don't know if this is going to work. I may have to do a conditional up above this. We'll find out. Props dot is disabled. So see what happens here. Well, we're disabled right now because we're not running. And then we start. And we stop it, and we're still disabled. So this is an annoying aspect of the way the disabled property works on web pages. Disabled doesn't actually check like its value. Basically, if it's there, it's disabled. If it's not there, it's not disabled. Annoying. So in order to do that correctly, we'd have to have some additional logic in here that basically either decides to render with this.
Do they
Do they have like a?
Oh, actually, maybe I have it backwards. Hold on. I might have it backwards and be wrong here.
Oh, is it working? I was wondering if they had it unless.
So let's see. Do I have this backwards? We want it to be disabled when we're running, right? So if is running is true, we want is disabled. Oh, I don't want to negate that. Nobody called me out on this? It's okay. There we go. All right. I think React is handling that for us. Because actually, that is sort of the way HTML works, but I think it's smart enough to handle that property for us. All right, so we've got that working, but we still have at least one case that this other one handled that we're not. What's that? If we go back and forth between the two, we have at least one case where our clear button is enabled, that it's disabled over here. That's right here at our starting point. We've got no time, but then in this one, it's disabled. So that's where we could put some additional logic here. And we could do this a lot of different ways. I'm going to do it in about the most bare bones way I could possibly do it, which is right here. I'm just going to inline in or this dot state dot elapsed time equal to 0. So what's going to happen is disabled is getting a Boolean value, true or false. So if we're running, it's going to get true because we're disabled. But if we're not running, then that'll be false. It'll evaluate the second part. So if our elapsed time is 0, then we should also be disabled. Let's see if this works. All right, looks promising. And you notice the clear button itself then got to keep this very clean interface of it can be disabled or not disabled. It didn't have to get passed in the elapsed time or whether it's running and do any computation on that. We let our stopwatch manage that logic and just compute some state to pass into the clear button as a property. So that keeps all this stopwatch based logic in this place as opposed to the clear button, which makes the clear button much easier to reuse. If we had, again, as we've talked about before, a different application where, a Twitter clone, where you're typing out something and you want to have a clear button to clear what you're typing because you decided you don't want it anymore, we could reuse this clear button. Sure, it's not complex, but it could get there could be a lot more in here, but we could reuse this in that application without having to change anything because it's just taking in what do I do when I clear, and it's just taking in whether or not I'm disabled. So the app can change that logic without changing the clear button component itself, which makes this a really nice little encapsulated component. And there is another change we could make here where if we start to look at similarities and what we want to do, I'm not going to do it right now, but this clear button takes in an on-clear function, and our start pause button takes in on start or pause, but really those are just sort of on clicks. So another change that you may consider making is renaming those as on click, letting it handle it internally, and then creating a common button component underneath both of these buttons that manages that sort of on click behavior. That way, if we start getting around to wanting to do styling for a button, it makes it very easy to have that styling propagate between those buttons. But we'll hold off on that for the time being. So let's come back and talk about what the difference is. So instead of, if I wanted to just do this inline, at least with the very simple set state version, I'm going to change it back over to what we had. So What's that? If we do this inline as sort of this very simple inline version of this, we can do that just fine as well, right? We can do this dot set state. It might get a little hard to read because I'm inlining it all. Elapsed time is 0. And I'm just going to let it keep running. So I've changed my function here, right? This is going back to what our first version was, where, no, I still have the other logic in there, which makes it so I don't have to have any of this special logic about resetting things. The clear button now is only available when your clock is stopped, so it never needs to stop the clock, right? But there was the question earlier about what's the difference between sort of this arrow function version and connecting to a method that's part of our components. For the most part, there's not much of a difference. There are some benefits to the arrow function in the sense that you don't have all this boilerplate, do your bind bit up here, which is nice. And that's because, and I talked about this before, I said arrow functions do have some differences between old-fashioned functions or methods, but you usually don't run into them immediately. One of the things that's different is it is automatically bound to the scope where it's declared, so it can't have this rebinding issue that happens that causes us to put this magic line up here. They can't lose their scope, so it'll always be in the scope that it was declared in. But one drawback to this, in certain cases, is this render function might get called a lot, particularly for, I don't know, a stopwatch component. And if we have an onClear method up here on our class that we've created and on this instance of it, then that'll get created one time, and that's when we create that instance of the stopwatch. And it'll get passed into our clear button every time, but the method, the function, was only created at one point in time. However, when you have it as sort of this arrow function version, every time that render is called, so in other words, every time your set interval changes or tick is called, then this function gets redeclared and you have a new function and you're throwing away the old functions and creating a new function. Now the cost of that is really pretty trivial. It's not a high cost at all in this case, but it can, have some performance implications. There's also one other thing that it can cause that won't matter just yet for you guys, but since it's a new function, every time that you create this, in this case, the clear button is the end of the tree, right? So it's the stopwatch and then the clear button. But if that clear button rendered other components down below and passed this around, or even if that clear button rendered other components at all, then since this is a new function every time you render, it'll have to re-render the clear button every time for React. It can never say, oh, all those properties are the same as the ones before, because it's not comparing whether the function would return the same results. It's just comparing whether it's the exact same function as before. So it's a lot like this bit of code here is if, and we've written stuff like this before, if we create two functions that look the same, so they do the same thing, is foo equal to bar? They're not, right? And that's because it's actually pointing to two different functions in like two different places in memory, and that's all it's comparing is, does this point to the same place in memory as this other one? Now, if we did like foo bar equals foo, all we did is say that foo bar now points to the same location as foo, so that's true. And that's the exact same issue here is when you write them inline, it means that React has a harder time or can't reconcile whether or not it actually needs to re-render that subtree. So it can cause a performance issue there too. So in general, like for small ones like this, it's very common to pass a function in this way as an arrow function. But a sort of rule of thumb, you know, not one that you have to follow. Some people get very strict about it. I think that's silly. Some people actually love arrow functions because of the simplicity, but the rule of thumb is, you know, you're going to have a little bit better performance, probably immeasurable in any apps that you're going to be writing for a period in time at least, by doing this approach instead. So does the clear button make sense? Any questions on the clear button? All right. I don't know if let me look over here. So I want to play with something a little different. I mean, was anybody really tripped up on the formatting of the number into something a little nicer? If you were, we can go over that. That part seems pretty common to stuff that you guys have done before. Nothing too new. What?
I just Googled how to like shorten
Okay.
the translation.
Sure. And then did anybody get hung up on like creating the component that printed that out? Because that should be pretty straightforward with what we've been doing. Okay, then I'm not going to go over that just now. I'll include a better formatted version of that stuff when I post like lesson 4 for this, for everybody to base stuff off of if they want to. But I want to talk about another problem that this version of our app has. And I already discussed it a little bit last class, but the way that we're hooking up or the way that we are updating our stuff is using a clear interval or a set interval. So it's calling something on an interval schedule, and that can have some real significant problems that might be easy to miss. They're going to be hard to recognize at first. So I'm going to see, I don't know if I can do this very effectively. I'm going to try and show the problems that this could have by trying to flood the JavaScript thread so that something else is locking it up a lot. So you might see what's happening, and then we might whiteboard exactly why this is a challenge. But let's see if I can do this. I'm going to set another interval. In this interval, I'm going to call a function. And this interval is every millisecond. I'm going to call a function that is going to I hope it doesn't optimize this out. I'm trying to create something that just does some busy work here. Doesn't really do anything, but I don't care that it does anything. I just want it to sort of lock up our processor and cause some problems. So let's see if this will work the way I want. That is not. I don't know if it's.
Where's the sun?
Here, let me do this. Might be enough to lock me up because console log is pretty expensive, believe it or not. So let's see. Nope, still very, very efficient. Ugh, it's too fast. All right, I need to go higher. What? Let's see. Still working. All right, let's add some extra zeros. There you go. Now you see the problem.
Got it.
It tells me not even a second has elapsed yet. What is going on? Why doesn't it think a second has gone by? Can anybody explain it?
I guess the arrow is based on when it gets back to that part of it. So it's like, there's a delay when it gets to.
Yeah. So this gets into a lot than any other programming language, or most. There's other ones that are like it. JavaScript is single-threaded. What that means is there's only ever one bit of JavaScript code running at any point in time. You can't spawn off something else. And so let's go to the whiteboard, because I think it'll make a lot more sense if we sketch out a timeline of what's happening here. So if this is our JavaScript for our timeline or whatever, and then we have what I'm going to put over here are our event queue. So this is where stuff gets put when, like, on click happens or a set interval. It goes into this event queue to say, when I'm free, pull the next item off this queue. So this is a timeline. You guys may not have seen this before. So this is a time. It's a little weird because you go down, but it's a very useful tool when you're looking at programming. So time is moving as we move down this chart, right? So farther down the chart, more time has elapsed. So let's say at the very beginning of our code here, we've got, and I'm going to use this, I think green will work best. I'm going to use this green marker to indicate that something's running on this JavaScript thread, right? Something is going on. So let's say right here we've got something running, and then during that time, it puts an event on this queue. And this one can be our tick event. So it's saying, all right, let's have a tick occur. So it gets put over here. But this can't actually run until there's a gap here for it to check for queues. So right here, it says, all right, this is done. Oh, let me go see if there's anything to pull off of this, right? And it sees this tick event in our queue. And you could write this out like an array, if you will, where it takes the last item in it. So right now there's only one thing in there, right? So it pulls that off, and now over here, it runs whatever that is, which is tick, until it's done. And then it will come back over here at that point in time and check and see if there's anything in our queue, right? And there's nothing there, so there's nothing for it to run. So it's available to run any bit of code. Now, what happens in this other case right here is we added another item, which is getting added to our queue more frequently than our tick is. So let's say we added tick here, and then we added our sum, is what I'll call it. And sum might take a really long time to run. And then tick's going to run here. So at this point in time, when tick started, now what we have is sum in our queue, because we pulled off the tick item to run. But Then we get added, so now our Q is going to be sum, but oh, we added another one in to our interval. We said we need to run another one of those. And we added another sum in, and then tick again, right? So this is our queue now of things that we can run. So now we pulled tick off of our queue. We hit this point in time, there's an open window. So now we can pull something else, and we pull sum. But sum takes quite a while to run. That's why I had to keep increasing that number to make my processors are very efficient nowadays. So you have to make it a large number. And then once it's pulled that off, it's here and it says, oh, now I have sum, and tick, because I took the first one off, right? So you notice this tick action still's like not going to get pulled off our queue until 2 more sums have run. And now down here, we'll have our next tick. And we're adding more and more on to the end of this the whole time, right? So put our tick on here. Roughly every 10 milliseconds, that tick got added to the queue. There was a gap where it could pull it, and so it pulled it in and ran it, and it looked like everything was just fine. Boom, 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 boom. We're adding this stuff immediately. Now we're putting something else in there that's filling up this queue, but the way that we're computing, if we go and look at our tick, the way that we're computing what our new state is we're just adding 10 to whatever our previous state was. We're not actually computing any sort of elapsed time in terms of how long has it been since we last updated our elapsed time. And that's why you get this behavior, because whenever it gets a chance to run that tick process, it adds 10, but the gaps between that are significantly more than 10 milliseconds apart.
Previous numbers were done with the time, the difference. Would that be better? Would it be more?
Yep, that's the only way to solve this problem, really.
I was wondering about that, in this queue that you already brought there, like if you do current time minus, start time minus the opposite, like, like current time versus start time. It's not an operation as well, and we're not.
Well, look at the
using
time on the clock.
It
It
is.
is, but that is rendering as well.
Yeah, so it
It's
hasn't
getting the
been
time.
affected by the other code because it's using whatever's the current time as opposed to counting.
What, you're completely correct. But if you look, this current time gets hung up too, I believe. So if we run this, you'll notice it's not updating actually every second. There's gaps there now.
Because it's also
But it's
related.
skipping ahead to the second that it should.
Yes, but so I think you're talking about two different things. Let me see if I can. Woo! All right.
Actually tick the way we want it to, like we get properly, but what it do is when it goes back to that function, it would be the accurate second that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not going to solve the gaps, but it will at least give us the accurate time. But is that what you were asking? Was that?
Yeah.
Okay. I thought you were asking about the fact that, computing the time is going to have a gap in time as well.
Maybe show, like displaying it, like if I don't know, I'm trying to think like you're doing things as well, because you have like an operational thing going on, minus something. But yeah, it's gonna be accurate because the get time is the real one,
Yeah.
even if
Right.
that's showing.
So let's brainstorm then real fast as a group. I think I want to switch it over to use this current time the way that we're talking about. I'm just going to use this as a notepad, put some stuff down here. So what are any other challenges or challenges that you can think of that might happen as a result of switching over to that? I know you encountered some of these, so.
Yes, I already did. The start pause button, instead of keeping the elapsed time, starts over. Stop button now.
Right, it needs to change its behavior, and that's because it can't just stop the timer because it's doing some sort of diff thing. Maybe it does, we'll see. Any other challenges?
I feel like it's mainly a thing of having a function that calculates and determines the value of elapsed time, and then the rest of it can kind of be the same as like just whatever for pause, whatever the current elapsed time is, the elapsed time. And if you hit clear, then the current elapsed time is 0. But that is really just a separate function that determines what the current elapsed time is.
Yeah.
So, but I guess that would be the key for that is like figure out
But then
the start
time would be the last lapse time.
Here's what I want to do. Let's take a few minutes and split up into groups and talk about how you might solve this if you're trying to use the dates instead of using just this elapsed time value and adding something to it. It might be useful for you to write something out on paper. Don't get stuck in code. Maybe you just want to write, like bust out some paper, sketch something out. Think about what might you try and do, and think about how you would make it work for the function that we have right now. What happens when you click start? What happens when you pause? And what's the behavior of the clear button? And what does that do for, what values do we want to store in state? How do we want to store something? And how do we want to clear something? So I think it'll be best if we, split up into groups and talk through it, because that'll help you get over whatever challenges you have, or maybe let you think of something that you were missing. Yeah, we can. We can give ourselves till maybe 7:40, but if you guys are done a little earlier. So we'll go about 5 minutes, I think.
So we have time now.
Yeah.
That would be also, that would just be for the same. But you need to start time. That's the start time would be very. So.
You guys want to talk again?
Start time. So the start time needs to be. I think it's like when we do get the start button, that needs to be when the start time is set. And then whenever we get
So you have
clear button.
So you have start time.
Yeah,
You
over
can
time,
if you want to,
now
just want to
minus.
talk to it.
It's not
Time now, like, I'm just using time now. because
So-
we use
So
every-
let's say,
Time
what do you want to have happen?
now, will
Yeah,
tell you,
Like what?
it will tell you the current.
So you probably missed it. So
Whatever
the way that we were
today's, and then you
trying
also
to
get the
work,
time.
we're adding
It's
is
time.
there's the ability to like
Yeah, whatever's the
measure
current.
things.
property within the state.
There's.
And what that gives you is an object that
Yeah,
has
Yeah,
current
it's
time.
date.
right?
or yeah, date, or something like that.
So that's a
So
good
that
approach.
just forever gives you.
So what if-
Actually,
What do you want to capture when you
time
click
or
start?
something, instead of doing a specific time, I'll just give it whenever.
So, who is that? Is that already started?
Yeah. What do we want to do when we click start? Like, we're going to this as instead of the last time.
Now it's.
So in programming, the current time is considered as being greater than whatever happens in the So the
Just start at
current
0?
time is-
So we're saying we just want to capture 0 when we hit start. So let's go
Current
out.
time versus start.
That's the
something a little-
elapsed time.
our new logic.
This is sort of a
That's
diagram
the
model
practice
that's following
side.
coding, which is sort of an action, that we do. So let's have our actions.
Keeping track of time again, but the
This is
time.
also like this is a stage diagram model where you're going from state to state. And then, what does that do to our state? So how does that change something? So when we take the start action from, like, when we go from
Start time. has been
initial
set, Then elapsed time is zero.
to start,
So it's gonna be like, or
you're saying what we're gonna do then is just set our elapsed time to 0?
Right, so we don't want to put 0 whenever.
No, that's true.
So
Anyway.
I think we should set start, state and start.
Okay.
So whatever, so start doesn't happen.
And then-
Starts back.
What are we going to do with,
So we're gonna change the start pause while we have this time.
Yeah.
Because when we talk,
the tick?
every time we press that thing, it's gonna run. Seven. And you
Yeah.
start by any time you're doing it.
So instead of, wait,
We're gonna go
we'll
up.
have to do is like the first time.
But how are we going to?
First I have to set, so I have to set the start time pause. Something like that.
Yeah.
Inside of the part, sorry, I guess it's.
The challenge we were having with the current version was that if we assume that this happened every 10 milliseconds, so we only added 10 milliseconds to our elapsed time,
To
it could
store
be wrong.
somehow, that elapsed time. That we have in the scene. There's a lot of it, just the same one.
Check.
But then
Yeah,
not
yes.
that
What about if we,
Start.
let's try and change this, and maybe that would be a starting point.
What
What if instead of,
That's what I said to you.
what if we did two things here? We're gonna do two things.
So here's the function.
Racing it very badly.
Start.
That's the first step.
Run this function.
No, what if at this point we captured our
That's
start
dependent, like,
Equals time.
so,
time,
just
I'm
by
just
the
calling
other
it
process.
Right.
to our due date, so we got that exact point in time captured.
You go on to start.
And what if we set our
Pause
elapsed
function.
time,
So that's that.
like we were
Then
doing
we
before?
Whenever
here
we
we
hit
update state
start,
of the-
it.
So now we have lots of information we
Say
don't want to do when we start. So
So
what
it's time now.
That's type.
what do we want to do when the tick occurs? Because we don't, let's say we don't know when the tick will occur. Somewhat random.
Whatever the method moves it.
The problem is
Take your
this
time.
then.
This is one story,
This
one
is
zero,
beginning,
but if
any
the story is not zero.
So how can we get to the
So it starts at 0, then it does time now minus start.
we gotta start time?
Little by
It's
that.
calculation.
So whatever this method is, calculates.
This is where we have to do something.
Okay,
So that gives us, when we started, what
but it is a
are
last
the
time.
configurations that we
At
now?
least to start with that, that's how
Start
I
time
try.
would be,
We can still.
It'll be time not now, it started 0, so we start out with time, start being 0 outside. And
The-
then it started 0, then. Well, how do we?
Yeah, well, we don't, yeah, let's say a really malicious person, I mean, random.
Pause doesn't
It's a
make any.
random interval.
What if you started, when
Check
it's
it out.
elapsed,
It's not
pause it,
consistent.
and then you start it again, you still want
So-
to have that 12 seconds, so you don't want to announce the start. Exactly.
Any ideas?
Yeah, so it's
Yeah.
gonna always look at.
What if we,
Because a minute might
when the
have
tick
passed, but
occurs,
if you pause it for
we
a
figure
minute.
out when,
So it can't be time
Now,
not down
yes.
here, I guess we'll have to.
so
give
at
it
that point in time, we say, now,
Start now.
equals
State.
due date,
So instead of doing time
Which is the
now,
point
here
in
we'll
time
have
for
to
the tick.
do,
One is state.
so adding this extra piece of information, and we also have
so I
these.
guess pause, we'll have to start your pause, but. we'll
So
have to
using
do
that stuff, we figure out the last time,
Time that now.
is that,
No,
how are we gonna do that?
build a stopwatch.
What part?
Start time is it. When we start.
Plus the last time?
Yeah, I don't know, as far as I.
How do you say day last?
It's a little bit weird, because we don't think about doing this with dates very often.
Oh.
But we can think about doing it with
We have
time, so let's say,
We're good, we have 0, start.
let's say
Say now,
at
blah, 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 we have that.
7:03,
President again.
I went to the store.
Okay,
Right.
one
And then,
That's
Yeah, yeah.
equal.
let's say,
So.
I don't know why,
Use that last
you know,
time to say it.
but you're just wondering,
Other kind
how
of-
long has it been since I left to go to the store? It's taking me forever,
Can we
right?
have start time?
How do you
end time
figure
for
out,
that?
so it's sometime later. How do you figure out how long it's been since I left to
So we can go
go to the store?
and.
Use like a, and like, so it adds.
Yeah, which is
Or
say-
subtract it.
Yeah, like using the
Yeah.
time.
So, you know, if it's
start time,
7:40,
everything else.
But you did put the last time to it, so you're still adding.
right now,
I'm just gonna
it
try to
says,
figure out where
and
it
then
is, how do you
going
know
for
when to
37
Like,
minutes.
how do you know it's the first time you put it start?
So
versus
now,
the
when
next
it's
time
the
you
start time,
start,
it's
it's supposed to add
the
time.
last time. So that's what we
That's-
did.
It's supposed to-
Because you have this common thing on.
Right.
This one.
So we can make that
Kind of like.
equal to now minus the start time.
We have just have one.
There's, start time's never going to change. It's
Saying
all
everything
about-
again to zero,
And
so
then
it's
we
okay.
get, the last time, every time. Does that make sense?
As if I've never built any of the other stuff.
All right, so let's try with
Just
another
trying to
one.
figure out how much
What
time.
happens when we go from,
So at first,
So like you said.
the running
like, yeah,
state
more than information, I was like,
to pause? This one's weird.
Yeah, because then.
This is where I think you're probably spending a lot of
This
time.
pause, this pause.
I don't have the answer. What?
well, we are still.
So let's
in
presume that
December.
what we want to do at this point is continually show, and yeah, we
We need
actually,
to
it's
sort
really easy.
the-
We just want to keep
figure out
showing the same last time.
What
before
number,
I pause.
when to do adding and when to do subtracting.
So what sort of stuff we want to do now?
Can we do that with the statement? Because you're saying if start time is zero. You start point two.
It's a little tricky in this diagram. Whatever it
Start
is.
time is not zero.
That's good.
So
This is right there.
We did our last time, which let's presume now.
And it probably
Right.
not even something,
Come on.
I would recommend much.
Yeah, so I think that's.
Sometimes I
that's
do,
what we have to do.
Or one thing we could do, we could always do the same thing we did
Uh,
on a tip, we could repeat our last time and
if it's the first time.
right, so that it's correct to that point in time.
Second or third time.
And then there's something that's sort of missed up,
What I
which
do when I get in it.
was,
It's,
you know,
some
we need,
issues
we
are
set
very,
another
very,
big stage for usage running,
so many times.
right?
Like,
So then we can pause,
and
right?
then I'll
We
reset
did our
some
last
by
time,
zero.
I'm
So
gonna
like
just do
on
it this
clear,
way.
reset some to zero, and then you
Did you
start
date
again. If
step
some
again?
is one,
I
then
know you
instead
did.
of doing.
Yeah. You did it up and
Set
down.
the
pause,
start
right?
time again, we're just going to do that.
Yeah.
Now comes the really tricky one.
14.
What do we wanna do when we go
That's
pause?
creating one every second, that's 100 milliseconds.
What?
That's
I'll
good.
just time and then.
To running again,
Oh,
right?
yeah. We have to do something else with it.
This is the really tricky one.
It'd be a lapse time plus
But then what I want to
that
do
same
is turn to
subtraction.
back.
Yeah.
Just get like an additional start time minus, I mean, another time dot now. So it's like if
Ah,
A plus B.
that's good thing, so what do you say?
You do that this
Minus time that was paused.
No, no, that's the counter signing up.
So what you're doing is
Stop
start
doing
that one back to the current
for last time, it's the start time.
Oh, I see.
Minus the
Oh,
start
that's
time.
And then add the previous
Add
one.
the last
I
time.
see a problem with this in a minute.
But now it's based on if this was the first time we hit start cost or if this is like the second time.
So do that.
But like,
Right.
Well, we're not
I know
missing
it's
last
like,
time, now we're just saying, right?
maybe it's separate things.
So use what we already have. That's interesting. We're going to have probably a problem with that, which is now what happens in this when you have a ticker. We didn't change.
Oh, yeah, that's one thing.
We didn't change the policy, so we already know what happens, right?
Just, I had to
So what it's going to do is it's going to change our last time.
This is a good chance.
Although I guess you can use this.
To be now
Plays through here.
minus start time.
Yes.
I like that idea. So we have
Exactly
one
right. No,
So let's say we let, I don't know, 10 seconds.
Now,
Those
we're
are
gonna
the
say
best
this
ones.
well,
Pause
time
This is
now.
gonna be
know,
over
start
time now, so.
Pause, start.
And that first
Yeah.
tick happens.
This-
So what happens in, you know, 100 milliseconds, it's gonna say now minus
The one that has a lapse.
100 milliseconds ago our last time, so our time's gonna jump 10
And then
seconds.
this right here, something like time now,
I have variables, so every time you take, that's how no matter what it is.
I like
Zero,
CSS. CSS and CSS, that's not really.
I like that too.
This is the tricky part about this
This is for a,
version of the code. This is-
Alright.
It's a deal, sometimes it's easy to do something and hard to do it the right way, right?
and then
This is where you start getting into tricky stuff, but this is why you want to,
following.
and it's a heck of a lot nicer to bring this out on the board like this.
Do that again?
And see the problem right now, that is to struggle with trying to get the syntax right,
Oh, this is the last time, I just.
how to get this working, and then you realize that your algorithm's wrong, and you need to do something different,
The lapse.
which I definitely don't do every day.
Yeah, they're all add 10 here and that.
Yeah, so instead of being 10 milliseconds, it would add 20 milliseconds to our lapse time, and that would throw us.
Yeah.
Right away, we'd be off.
Because the time now will be. More like the first time.
No, so you guys got it.
So.
So they don't just use zero.
Alright, so here's what we did.
Just now.
Here's what we did. Alright,
If they use zero, they subtract.
We do. But we missed something critical in another
So it doesn't matter if they're the same.
We missed something that we need to do on every day. What?
Yeah, we should have a problem.
You need to save your, it's not really start time, we change the start
We have
to
to
be
be
previous time, and then we update it every time I did.
Start.
And instead of our last time being
2 seconds, and I can
now,
start.
minus
Oh,
start line are now, so this is the previous time, so every time we we're updating the previous time, we say, now our logic for calculating last time was changed.
Start time. No. Because we need to
I don't know,
define
still think
start
about that.
time.
That's something.
Start the time.
How many times you click the,
Right.
click it?
Yeah, all along,
So you might render the stopwatch.
If some is,
You don't want it to start
first time,
right
some
away.
is zero,
You
and
need to go.
then beyond that, it'll be like plus.
So, real quickly, remember the rest of them, we actually saw all this in front of the class.
Right here. Start
I
time.
mean, it doesn't really matter what some is after,
You
after
just
zero.
get started.
Maybe you'll figure out how to do that.
It's probably them
Get back.
all of this. That.
They don't have to have the maybe for is, if, it's running, so if it's running is true, then we add some, otherwise we don't.
So we're gonna, we have to change.
Oh, I see, it's tested? Yeah. Let's do that. I also want to.
If it's just for the first time,
The now is one.
the thing is that it would be fine if we were not. Figuring it out first.
Or,
Oh, no, no,
When-
no,
when-
wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a
Zero,
minute.
it's starting zero, so.
Stop.
and then start, you don't want it to.
The first time, this doesn't matter, because the lapse time is zero.
Or we need to save driver.
So this is one thing we use. We don't need a different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We are storing it in a lapse time.
So when you say that you're gonna say this lifetime, last time. This.
Time now minus, whatever start time.
Start
And they're free, that's the thing, I have.
We can do something.
But we have to figure out how to set, start time. So this can just be the method for figuring out the last time, and it doesn't matter if it's the first time, because the last time
It
is
doesn't
zero.
matter how long.
I got
As soon as we hit start.
So just add
We
zero.
want it to have
Even
those
if it
values.
doesn't matter if it's running for one month.
So I want.
Yeah.
You can also.
Alright, fine.
We
Watch this.
don't need to.
I don't know. So.
We need to know when this reset starts.
Okay, so when we start our app, lapse time is 0. We're gonna have a due date plus 0. Students being from.
No.
All right.
We need to change the start time to be the last.
Let's figure it out.
Like, we need to add, this is the method, I'm saying it like that, that's what we're doing.
Killer.
Change your
Okay.
first line,
Not enough.
start time.
This is not enough. Okay. Yeah.
Start time
Due date.
equals last time, that quantity, less the original start time. So that'll be. No, equals time that.
All right. Give you guys a challenge here. Took a lot longer than I planned on, but I think there was a lot of good hands-on.
Something about
We'll have to have a separate method for the last.
Right. But we can subtract the date now.
But
So we get our lapse time.
We'll just use this.
they're like, we've got this. We've got this.
Alright.
I like it when people just can't give up.
Have you ever done, I do this a lot in Rails where I'll,
They're like, we're really close. All right. Well, anybody solve this? Anybody figure it out completely?
Pause. Yeah,
Okay, so let's try and build it out piece by piece. Let's see how we do. Let's start off with what happens when we click the start button. So on start, did anybody come up with a plan for what we want to do when we start?
Okay, we have a discussion thing, you can see if ours sounds
All right,
logical or not. I
let's.
mean, it's kind of,
I'm gonna go with implementing it up here, and we'll see how we get.
oh no, you can't implement it. 'Cause we don't. Well, the theory is that we just need one thing that calculates the elapsed time. So that'd be, and that it would really do, in the case of when you pause, and then restart, it would do elapsed time plus the current time minus the start time. But elapsed time would be 0 at first, so that wouldn't matter.
Right. All right.
And if you pause it, when it calls it again, and then we'll be changing the start time though. When you pause it and start it again, it'll be like whatever, how much time has elapsed. Plus, and then we'll have the time now minus the start time, which when you pause it and you start it up again, start time will be time, the current time.
When you start it up again, start time will be the current time. Yeah, that's very close to what we were trying first. So let's see what happens if we go with that. Let's see if this is what you're talking about. I'm going to try it and see if I'm getting what you're talking about, because I think
I think exactly the best way to make it so you know which time you're stopping and starting it.
so. Let's give it a go. Let's say, okay, when we start. So let's assume we're starting it, right? Then what we want to do is we want to set our, let's call it start time to the current time, right?
Yeah.
All right. That's fine. And then that works. And then inside of our tick,
Yeah.
we want to update our elapsed time somehow.
To elapsed time plus time out and minus start time, but elapsed time needs to be 0 at first.
Right, which it was at the beginning, so that's fine, and we can reset to 0 here. So let's try this. I think this will capture what you're talking about. Let's say let now equal new date. So now we have now, and we could do our elapsed time is now minus this dot state dot start time. So that'll give you how much time is ticked off, right? so far.
But to maintain the time that you had previously, you would need to add it to the previous elapsed time. Pause it and then you restart it. So we added the previous elapsed time to it. And then in clear, it would set elapsed time to 0.
Okay.
So when elapsed time is 0, it would just be adding 0.
So how did you? So I missed that a little bit. So you said you.
And we can save the current elapsed time to a variable if that makes it better. I don't know if you can call it in there, but maybe outside set a variable to put whatever elapsed time is. And there we add the elapsed time to that now minus the start time.
So you would do that on every tick, or you would do that only when you unpause?
That would be only when you do pause or unpause when we do start.
Okay.
When it
Right, you could say, I can add that in here right now. So I think I get what you're saying,
I don't know how to, I haven't.
but let me see here. So what you're saying is when we start or when we unpause, we want our elapsed time to be whatever the elapsed time was before? Yeah. Okay, so that'll naturally happen because we're not going to change our elapsed time.
We're gonna add it to.
It's just replacing one of the values.
No, because you have time, when you unpause it, it already had time on it, and we want to take that time on it, and then we want to add to it whatever time has passed after that. When we've started up again.
Okay, I see. So maybe, so let's see if this is a way to do that. And I think that would work. It's different than what I was thinking, but I think it works. So let me change it just a slight bit to see if I can explain it in a way that makes sense on what you're saying. So let's say I'm going to, so only if we are, let's say only if we're unpausing. So we want to, we'll put an extra bit of logic here that says, I have to do it around like where our previous is running value was, right? So let's, I'll just put it right up here before I've changed that value. If this dot state dot is running, so not running, so it was paused, right? So let's see if this captures what you're trying to get at. Then what we want to do is we want to set state, and what we want to capture here is, I'm just going to call it previous elapsed time, and set that to what is this dot state dot elapsed time. So we were sort of holding on to that value in our state, but only when we're unpausing. And then what we want is whenever we are performing a tick action, because we're updating our time, then our elapsed time is actually going to be now minus this dot state dot start time plus, and I'm going to do this in sort of a hack way because you were talking about like what needs to be 0 initially, etc., which we could do, and I could put it up there, but I just want to stay here in the code. This dot state dot previous elapsed time or 0. So I think that's sort of capturing what you were getting at.
Yeah.
Let's give it a go. I don't know.
The 0 thing there, this state.
Because we haven't set like.
I'm going to get rid of a lot of these, but
We press the button.
all right. Well, we're seeing something interesting. Now I'm going to bring a lot of these back. Testing. Let's see what happens. Huh?
Yeah.
It's looking decent, at least at first. All right. We pause. Now let's start back up again.
Oh no. Oh no, that's right. That's right. No, that's not right.
Pause it.
It's not right. I think you'll see it in a minute.
It needs to add.
I figured out why it's not. So what's happening is every time you're computing your tick, you're adding in your previous elapsed time as opposed to just the first time, which means whatever your previous elapsed time was, it's jumping up by that much more. So maybe my change of what you were doing changed the logic, right? Because
I mean, is that really, I guess, a tick anymore?
right.
I would replace the value of the start time by the elapsed time. So just three variables in the beginning and then just two.
Yeah. That's interesting. I think you could get this to work with just a slight change. I think you could. I'm not sure what it would be off the top of my head, but I think you could get this strategy to work. So I like it. Far off from where I would go. So here's, anybody else have a different approach? You guys were close back there with, was it the same approach?
Yeah, pretty much.
So
Very similar.
here's how I'd tackle this, which is all very similar. You're not going to notice significant differences at first, right? So I'm going to get rid of this extra conditional logic here. I don't care about that. Let's just say, so when is running happens, I'm not going to call this start time. What I'm going to call this is previous time. Or I'm going to call it previous tick. Is what I'm going to call it. And I'm going to capture the date then. The time then. And then what I'm going to do is when a tick happens down here, and I'm probably going to have to change some other stuff. What I'm going to do is, and I'm working through this on the idea of solving one problem at a time. So first I'm solving what I want to do when I start, which is the easy one, right? If, okay, we're going to start, we're doing the ticks, not that hard. So let's go back to this logic that we had where I'll get rid of that. And the elapsed time, let's assume we do want to care about this elapsed time bit still, is now minus this dot state dot start time or previous tick, right? So this doesn't solve everything yet. I'm sort of tackling it piece by piece, and we'll see the problem with this in just a moment. So let me get rid of this long delay, bring this down to something more reasonable real fast, and let's see what happens. All right, that's all looking fine. But it restarts from scratch every time I click it, right? So we've got a problem there because we are getting our previous tick, and what happens when we pause is just fine. It sets our previous tick to when we pause, but that's not being used, so it doesn't matter. And then when we start back up again, it resets this value to that point in time. But down here now, our computation is wrong because its elapsed time is now minus the, whatever point we started back up at, not the original time, right? So that's a little bit of an issue, but we do have it at least doing the one bit. So maybe we can change our behavior here. What if we don't think of just updating elapsed time on our tick? I sort of gave a huge hint here how we might deal with this. What other value do you think we could change in here whenever we have a timer tick off? Let's update our previous tick, and let's make that now. So every time we tick, we're going to update when was the last time we ticked. All right? Now, of course, we're going to have a problem because we're just constantly updating it. But now we can change our logic for computing elapsed time, because all we're getting every tick is the difference between when we last computed our time and now. That's the only thing that we're getting whenever we have a tick occur. We're not getting our total time, but it's pretty easy to get that from what we have now, we can just do whatever our previous elapsed time was plus the new amount of time that ticks up. And then it should just tick up every time. Now let's put in an extra long delay here again and see if we get there.
This is almost what I had. Okay,
It's very close to what you guys were describing. Yeah.
but less complicated.
Let's see if this works. There might be a bug. I don't know.
Here now, it wasn't take function or.
Looks like it's working now, I think. Does that make sense? Yeah. I mean, I know it wasn't exactly React, like digging into building something with React, but it's a good programming type of exercise, the type of thing that you'll encounter. This is, I would not be surprised if somebody gave you guys something like this if you ever did an interview. This is straight up an interview style question. Like, I actually haven't done this before. What? Yeah. I haven't done this before, but I'm not kidding. I may put this in an interview I do in the future now. I was like, ooh, I like this. This might be an interview question. Not the whole stopwatch, but I may give you a lot of the stopwatch bit and say, how do you compute the value at the point in time, right? Because that's sort of one of those puzzle, challenging, think through how to solve it programming issues. Anyways, I think this works. There may be a bug with it. How close was it to what other people were working out? Was it close? Far off? They're like, we're too focused on our solution now. Yeah, but this is now a stopwatch that it doesn't matter if you've got something interrupting your time. Sure, it won't update, but it's going to be accurate. So, are you laughing how slow it is? That's because I still have my delay garbage in here. So if I get rid of all that, oh, it's got to refresh. Oh, it won't even refresh because it's so.
Yeah, maybe we should just cancel out that or comment out that code.
That's not even going to work. The browser was just hung because I gave it such a resource-intensive thread.
Oh.
So now we work, and you notice we get every bit of the milliseconds now that can change. So. Yee. All right. This will be our, I think this right here will be our starting code for the next one. So this will be like the lesson 4 starting base. We may play around with stuff more, but this is what I think we'll start with. The next, I don't know if we'll do it Thursday. I'm going to send out right after class here, post on forums and stuff, a link to the RTP 180. If people are interested in going to that, respond, let me know. Because Daisy's going to be talking at that. That's this Thursday, I believe. It's not here. It's at a different location. If people can't make it, people want to come to class, let me know as well. I'll be happy to come here. But I just want to give people the opportunity, if you're interested in that. I also don't know if everyone can go. I don't know if they still serve beer or not. They used to. But they used to give out like tickets if you were over 21 or something. So it's at the Frontier, which is right in the middle of RTP. So it's smack dab between Durham and Raleigh, right off of 40. What? It's like Thursday. Yeah, they do. So they do something called RTP 180 every month, which is like lightning talks. And then I think they do, normally they've had like a happy hour thing with it. I haven't gone in a long time, but Daisy's going to be speaking. This month is like diversity. So she's going to be talking about some of that. That's why I'm proposing it. I think it would be really cool to, have a crowd representing. I haven't checked to see if there's tickets available, but there are.
Wait, what is this? I was like,
Deep in the code. I'm gonna post it on Slack. Don't worry. So who even tried to tackle the tweets, the other assignments? You? Did you guys accomplish it? Did you get stuck? You got done? You get done? Yeah? All right. Anybody else try to tackle that? Cool. So I think even though we may do something else by Thursday, the other bit I want people to do is work on that, try and tackle that, and post if you're having any problems or are stuck. Probably won't go over it because I think, as I said, the next thing I want to go over is adding some style to this. To our app. Let's get it more stylish. It's pretty ugly. So that's going to involve another thing that you would do a lot if you were working on a real application, which is we're going to pull in a framework that gives us some styling, some sort of UI framework, and change our components to use those so that it's pretty. Yeah, like Bootstrap. I'll probably post, I think I'll post maybe 3 and do the old vote with a different emoji type thing on Slack. So it's like a poor man's way of voting. It's like, hey, if you want to try this framework, if you want us to use this framework, upvote with this or whatever, otherwise this. So then you can just click them as sort of a cheap way of voting. That way you don't have to install like a plugin to do that.
Can we use just CSS?
We could write our own CSS, yeah.
Because I have to learn that.
What?
I have to learn a new framework to style that.
We may write some of our own CSS, but you'll get to see that a lot of it will just come sort of for free.
Yeah.
So a lot of it will come for free without us even having to do most of that.
Great.
But just,
so you're worried about like another site?
I don't want to learn something right now.
It's not really
the CSS that I
Look,
know.
I don't do styling stuff like I'm back in Shirley, whatever it is, but it's really easy. Like, because really what you're doing is because at least with Bootstrap, you're importing in their style sheet. So you just put into it like for button, it's BTN, and then you'd be like BTN LG in one of it.
right.
Like, and they have a whole bunch of pages that show you, and you're just like,
I really don't know very much about Bootstrap. But
This will be a little,
made a lot with still CSS didn't have all the new functions.
here, let me give you an example so that you're not too intimidated.
But now you can That's exactly
This is an example of what we'll be doing. So it shouldn't be too bad, but, oh, I have my,
They have columns.
my thing is still running. Stop this, it's slowing me down. So here's an example of what we'll be using. We may use this Material UI framework, right? And so it won't be that hard. If we go over here and look, it'll be a lot like this, where we'll just, instead of using a button, an HTML button element as our base level thing, we'll just pull in their button component. So this is being imported up here from this Material UI. Just like we're using our own components, we're just going to grab somebody else's components and use them directly, a lot like this. And then we'll get really cool styling like this with very little effort. So that's what I want to play around with and show you guys, because that's part of the aspect of building like a very professional looking site, is being able to do some of this. And it's a lot easier when you can leverage somebody else's style as opposed to writing your own. Plus, it's a great, these frameworks are a great example of how to use other people's React components. There's some of the easier ones, UI frameworks, versus some of the more complex React components when you're pulling in other stuff. And you just get a lot of really cool stuff without too much work. So that's what we'll do. This will be one of the examples that I'll give as a reference if people want to use this Material UI one.
If you want to change the color, for instance.
Yeah, you can change the color. Like here's one that just says use the primary color. And then here's a button that just said use secondary color. Well, in this case, it's not, but they're close, yes.
Is there a warning?
You know, you can have different types of buttons, like here's bordered buttons, here's contained buttons, here's floating action buttons, different sizes, here's icon buttons, and all of that's pretty easy. And so, yeah, we'll play around with some of that so that we can just get a chance to try and make our app pretty with and see how easy it is to do some of that. So that's the goal for the next time we get together, so that we'll have something that maybe competes with this, even vaguely.
I'm excited.
Oh yeah, I did say, so I'm not going to have this out tonight. I'll have it out tomorrow for the updated version of this code for lesson 4, because I also want to fix the number so that against milliseconds or whatever, and I haven't changed that in this stuff yet. So you can, you know, I want people to feel like they can do that. Just, you know, make sure that, I mean, there's nothing like, we're not submitting these to me for a grade or anything directly. So if you don't have bits of it that are functional, you know, that's fine. Just know that, you know, if you're keeping your own, you'll have to keep up with making sure that all your pieces are functional as well, on your own. That's the only challenge there. So.
I couldn't do the last. I did lesson 1 and then I did lesson 1.
Right.
But it's work.
I mean, it's fine to do that. Like I say, just recognize that you'll have to make sure that your stuff is functioning on your own at that point if you've forked off. All right. Are there any other questions? No? Well, then I don't want to hold this up anymore. Tonight, let me